Today on the Medical Humanities podcast, Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen. Elizabeth Tudor, Queen Elizabeth I of England, is perhaps one of the most famous monarchs in all of history. She reigned for 45 years during a time of tumultuous religious and political upheaval, survived several assassination attempts, and famously addressed her army with the proclamation that she had the heart and stomach of a king. But in spite of her many accomplishments, even in spite of famously, or infamously, ordering the death of her cousin, Mary Queen of Scots, Elizabeth I is primarily known for one particular thing: her virginity. Or rather, whether she was being truthful about it. To this day, both professional and amateur historians and lovers of all things Tudor debate this question with energy and passion, as scholars have done ever since Elizabeth took the throne. Was she truly a virgin when she became queen at 25? And are we to believe that she remained so for her entire life, married or not? To some in the modern era, this seems a virtual impossibility, or at best, improbable to the point of straining credulity. To others, Elizabeth's iron will and steely determination make it very likely that if she vowed to do a thing, she kept that vow. I'm not going to dive too deeply into this subject, since it's well-trodden territory and most of it doesn't fit within the medical humanities. But I would like to discuss some of the more interesting rumors that swirled around Elizabeth regarding her sex, her virginity, and her refusal to marry. But before I begin, I want to be clear that this episode is comprised of nothing but conjecture and opinions, both mine and those of other authors, and is in no way meant to sully or vindicate, as the case may be, the reputation of one of England's greatest monarchs. I'm not judging Elizabeth as a person, nor am I trying to pry into the private life of a woman who, while dead nearly 500 years, still deserves dignity and respect. I simply want to present some discussion points about her public persona as the Virgin Queen. So, let's begin with the first scandal to hit Elizabeth, the Seymour Scandal. As I said, Elizabeth grew up in turmoil and political upheaval, and before the age of 3 had lost her mother and been demoted from princess to a mere lady. When her father, Henry VIII, died in 1547, and her 10-year-old Protestant brother Edward became king, 14-year-old Elizabeth's value as a potential heir to the throne was suddenly brought into sharper focus. Enter Tom Seymour, maternal uncle to the king. Even before Henry's death, Seymour had schemed to marry the young Elizabeth. When that failed, he did the next best thing. After Henry's death, he married the king's 6th and final wife, Catherine Parr, a woman he had supposedly been in love with for 20 years. Perhaps he was spurred on by love. Perhaps it was because after 4 strategic marriages, Catherine was finally free to make her own choice. Or perhaps it was because Catherine and her stepdaughter Elizabeth were extremely close. So close that Elizabeth came to live with Catherine and her new husband soon after Henry's death. Did Catherine know her beloved Tom had tried to marry Elizabeth before marrying her? It's hard to know. Marriage often had nothing to do with love in the upper echelons of Tudor society, and perhaps, if she had known of his plans, she would have regarded them as sanguinely as she had viewed her own multiple marriages. But whatever the case, incidents in the new Seymour household shed light on what is often considered a formative moment in Elizabeth's life: her introduction to the dangers of flirtation and indiscretion. The Seymour Scandal, as it came to be called, involved episodes of inappropriate behavior by Tom, and sometimes Catherine too. Reportedly, Seymour would enter Elizabeth's bedchamber early in the morning, himself wearing only his bedclothes, and would tickle and slap her until she could manage to get away. On one occasion, Catherine Parr allegedly held the princess down while Seymour cut her nightdress to pieces with scissors. Elizabeth's governess, Kat Ashley, raised concerns about this behavior, but nothing was ever done about it. Since Catherine was in the room when this happened, the spirit of the horseplay was unclear. Was Tom really just roughhousing with his wife's stepdaughter? Or was there a seedier sexual element to the play that Catherine was too blind to see? Some historians believe that Elizabeth became pregnant by Tom Seymour during this time, although there is no evidence to support this claim, and, as we'll see, Elizabeth denied having any sexual involvement with him. Whether Tom's intentions were salacious or not, Elizabeth must have grown up quite quickly in that household, if she wasn't already a mature and forthright woman of the world. Catherine Parr apparently thought she was. When she caught Seymour and Elizabeth in, quote, an embrace, she sent Elizabeth away from her house. Catherine died in childbirth that autumn, and Seymour immediately made plans to marry Elizabeth, to position himself that much closer to the throne. Before he could marry her, however, he was arrested after breaking into his nephew, the young King Edward's apartments at Hampton Court Palace, with a pistol. His intentions were unclear, but he was questioned, along with Elizabeth and everyone in her household. She vehemently denied any knowledge of Seymour's plan or any sexual involvement with him, and fortunately was believed. She was released without charge, but Seymour was found guilty of treason and executed. It's commonly held that this scandal taught the 15-year-old princess a valuable lesson about how even innocent flirtation could ruin the reputation of a young woman, and in this case possibly even threaten her life. Even the hint of a sexual liaison with Seymour cast suspicion on her as a potential traitor. She saw firsthand how vital it was to maintain an untarnished public image, and that women were held to different standards than men when it came to sexuality. Naturally, no one even considered that the young teenager was the victim of a grasping, much older abuser who sought to use her to gain power. It may have been this traumatic incident that led Elizabeth to swear off marriage and sexual relationships forever. When Elizabeth, somewhat surprisingly, ascended the throne at the age of 25, having survived her Catholic sister Mary's temptation to have her executed, she inherited a bitterly divided kingdom. As the first anointed Protestant queen, her cousin Jane Grey had briefly reigned for 9 days, but had never been officially crowned. All of Catholic Europe immediately denounced her, claiming that she had a, quote, filthy lust that defiled her body and the country. The Pope even declared that it would not be a sin for any Catholic to kill her, and at least a few of them tried. Rumors and gossip swept the land. Her childhood friend Robert Dudley was her lover, it was claimed, because they lived in side-by-side apartments and visited each other until the wee hours, apparently playing cards. When Dudley's wife died under suspicious circumstances, many of her detractors claimed Elizabeth had murdered her so that she and Dudley could marry. It, in fact, had the opposite effect, as both Dudley and Elizabeth knew they could never marry after such a scandal. And so Elizabeth became more determined than ever to maintain her public persona and reputation as a chaste and virginal queen. She vowed never to marry, presenting herself with a great deal of theatricality and dazzling grandeur in her attire, makeup, and wigs. Her enemies called her a whore nonetheless, and the French king joked that debate about the queen's virtue made for lively discussion at his court. Just why she refused to marry has been the subject of much conjecture over the years, and while it's beyond the scope of this episode to go into the many possible reasons, there have been some very entertaining theories that claim to explain it. The first theory is that Elizabeth was born with both male and female genitalia, and that she chose never to marry because she knew she would never be able to have a child. This, the theory goes, accounts for her, quote, mannishness and her unfeminine ways, her, quote, heart and stomach of a king, as she herself declared. But even if this were true, No one in Tudor England would have known whether hermaphrodite people were capable of reproducing or not. That's what they were called then, the name a mixture of the male Greek god Hermes and the female Greek goddess Aphrodite. The modern term intersex is now preferable, and it's now well known that chromosomes determine the development of one's sex organs, regardless of the physical appearance of maleness and femaleness. Intersex people are unique. Some have ovaries and wombs and can carry children. Some have functioning testes and can produce sperm. But the salient point is, if Elizabeth had, in fact, been born intersex, there wouldn't have been any way of knowing what her future held. This theory also fails the common sense test. Elizabeth's father, Henry, was so desperate for a legitimate male heir that he'd ripped apart the Catholic Church just for another chance at producing one. The Tudor dynasty was only 2 kings old, and Henry would have done anything to secure the line with at least one strapping young lad. If his wife Anne Boleyn had given birth to a child that possessed male genitalia, it is, in my opinion, a certainty that child would have been declared a boy. They would have simply ignored her female parts and celebrated the birth of a legitimate prince. She'd have probably been named Edward or maybe Henry and raised as a prince, and whether she began to menstruate later in life or develop breasts would have been seen as irrelevant, something that could be hidden from public view. On to the Bizly Boy. Another theory verges on the absurd, if entertaining. In the summer of 1543, an outbreak of the bubonic plague gripped London, and Henry VIII sent the 10-year-old Lady Elizabeth to the small Gloucester village of Bizly to escape the danger. As the story goes, Elizabeth contracted the plague anyway and died. Her governess, Cat Ashley, and guardian, Thomas Parry, flew into a panic and, afraid for their very lives, devised a plot to conceal the girl's death by substituting another child as her stand-in. They searched the village for a 10-year-old girl with red hair, but found none. The only child that bore resemblance to Elizabeth was a boy called Neville. Deciding that it was worth a try, Ashley and Parry put a dress and a wig on Neville and passed him off as Elizabeth. And for some reason, apparently, neither her father nor anyone else who knew her noticed that the child who returned from Bizly was now, in fact, a completely different person. As outlandish as this seems, the rumor was given a fair hearing by some, because Cat Ashley became Elizabeth's main lady of the bedchamber, the only woman who would help her dress and undress, and therefore the only woman who would see her fully nude. Ashley also helped Elizabeth apply her thick makeup, which some claim was done to help the Queen disguise her need to shave every day. There was no mention of how the ladies who attended to her linens would have reacted to the complete lack of menstrual blood on her sheets, of course, or how this young boy Neville conveniently grew up slight and feminine in appearance, enough to convince everyone who met him that he was a woman. The theory seems to rest on the closeness of Elizabeth and her alleged co-conspirators. Thomas Parry was appointed the Queen's Privy Council and was knighted for his service, and he and Cat Ashley remained so close to the Queen throughout her reign that in 1589, courtier Sir Thomas Tyrwhitt wrote that there appeared to be a closely held secret between the three of them, one that they had, quote, formed a pact to take to the grave. Some historians even point to the fact that Elizabeth refused to be autopsied after her death as proof that she was hiding her true sex from the world. It's more likely that as a devout Christian, like most people in Tudor England, she would have considered the desecration of her body a blasphemy. This Bizly theory would surely have faded from memory, if not for Dracula author Bram Stoker's 1910 book, Famous Impostors. Stoker devoted an entire chapter to the Bizly Boy theory, basing much of his belief on the discovery, in Bizly, of the grave of a very wealthy young girl, and the subsequent years of speculation as to why Elizabeth would never bear a child. Stoker also seemed convinced by Elizabeth's famous quote that she had the heart and stomach of a king, but he conveniently ignored the first part of that quote, where she stated, "I know I have the body, but of a weak and feeble woman." Running through the speculation that abounded at the time, as Stoker outlines, among ambassadors and courtiers at Elizabeth's court, It's amusing to read the clear bafflement of these men, who seemed unable to account for the existence of a woman who simply chose not to marry. And next, the pregnancy portrait. You may have seen the alleged pregnancy portrait of Elizabeth, a painting of an Elizabethan woman wearing an elaborate, voluminous brocade gown that some believe depicts her in the late stages of pregnancy. Titled Portrait of an Unknown Woman and painted by Marcus Gerhardts the Younger in the 1590s, it hangs in Hampton Court Palace as part of the Royal Collection. As stated by the Royal Collection Trust, this painting was once thought to be that of Elizabeth I, but only until the attribution to Gerhardts was definitively made, and the painting therefore dated. In the 1590s, Elizabeth was in her 60s, and this fact should immediately dispel any rumors that the subject of this painting, if indeed pregnant, was the Queen. There has been much scholarship devoted to this painting, most notably by David Shakespeare, a retired orthopedic surgeon who has done a great deal of research into the artwork, and, as recently as 2018, continued to assert that it depicted a pregnant Elizabeth. Shakespeare has produced a video and a lengthy PDF explaining his theories, a link to which you'll find in the sources section of the transcript of this video. However, in my opinion, if you're looking for a more balanced and sensible interpretation of what this painting depicts, I suggest you watch the video by Dr. Kat Marchant on her YouTube channel, Reading the Past. Dr. Marchant does a thorough job of analyzing both the portrait and Dr. Shakespeare's interpretation of it, again, linked to in the sources section of the transcript. Dr. Marchant also addresses some of the rumors that Elizabeth gave birth to various sons by various fathers, and puts forth an opinion that aligns with mine. Elizabeth lived in an age when a high-profile woman, and certainly a queen, was almost never alone. As Dr. Marchant says, she never ate, slept, or bathed alone, and all of her personal bed linen was taken care of by others. If she had stopped menstruating, it would have been noted and commented upon. And if she had developed a baby bump or given birth, it would have been virtually impossible to hide. I believe it's too far-fetched to think this is a portrait of a pregnant Elizabeth. Again, the common sense test must be applied here. Why would an unmarried queen hide a pregnancy so well as to have it go unnoticed, for the rumors of her alleged sons only surfaced when the supposed offspring were grown men, only to then commission a portrait of herself in that condition? Why would Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, pose for a portrait showing her pregnant body? It simply doesn't make sense. Given the proof of when this portrait was painted and the postmenopausal age of Elizabeth at the time, the only concession some might make is that the painting is allegorical, depicting a metaphorically fertile Elizabeth, glorifying her role as mother of a great nation. Now, there is one more theory about Elizabeth that doesn't attempt to explain why she didn't marry, but does seek to prove that she did not die a virgin. The rumor that Elizabeth had to wear a wig because her hair had fallen out due to syphilis. While there is no definitive cause of death for Elizabeth, it is believed that she died due to lead poisoning. For most of her 45-year reign, she wore a ghostly white, lead-based makeup called Venetian ceruse, or the spirits of Saturn, which was deemed poisonous 30 years after her death. When she died at Richmond Palace in her 69th year, she was wearing makeup over an inch thick. Lead poisoning leads to some of the symptoms she exhibited at the end of her life, including losing all her teeth and hair. Some detractors, though, claim that her symptoms were caused by syphilis. Syphilis is a sexually transmitted disease caused by the spirochete, or spiral bacteria, Treponema pallidum. Its name comes from a poem, Syphilis, sive morbus gallicus, or Syphilis, or the French disease, written by a Veronese physician in 1530, about a shepherd who was allegedly the first sufferer of the disease. Syphilis occurs in stages. The first stage typically presents with a sore or chancre at the point of entry into the body. This usually heals within weeks, after which the symptoms of the second stage briefly appear, such as a body-wide rash, fever, sore throat, patchy hair loss, and fatigue. These too will disappear, even without treatment. The disease then enters the latent stage, which, while no longer contagious, can affect the nerves, heart, brain, and bones, among others. This stage can last for years, sometimes even decades. Some sufferers progress to the final or tertiary stage, which is fatal. Hair loss is a symptom of secondary syphilis, which occurs within several weeks of infection and can come and go over the period of a year. If the rumors were true, and Elizabeth had been balding from syphilis when she died, then it would have meant she'd contracted the disease at nearly 70 years of age. While this is not impossible, it does beggar belief that a 70-year-old unmarried monarch in 17th century England would be engaging in casual sexual relations to the point of becoming infected with an STD. Furthermore, if she had died from syphilis, which some rumors insist, that would mean she had progressed to the final tertiary stage of syphilis, which would have exhibited far more symptoms than were ever noted, including possible non-cancerous bulbous growths on her face, blindness, and insanity. Sir William Osler called syphilis the great imitator because it can cause symptoms similar to other diseases. This fact, ironically, is what helps cast doubt on a diagnosis of syphilis. If syphilis can look like many other diseases, including lead poisoning, then it stands to reason that many other diseases can look like syphilis. In other words, you see what you want to see. If you want to believe Elizabeth was sexually active, you may be inclined to view her symptoms as those of syphilis. If you want to believe she was chaste, then lead poisoning will seem to be the more obvious cause. But I personally find it hard to believe that she had syphilis all her life without noticing the symptoms, or else had contracted it in her old age. Occam's razor, the simplest answer tends to be the correct one, leads me to suspect her poisonous makeup, worn for 45 years, was the cause of her death. There are a number of reasons why Elizabeth may have chosen to remain unmarried, and therefore even more reasons to remain a virgin. What would she have done if she'd become pregnant by one of her supposed lovers? She likely would have had to marry someone quite quickly to cover it up, and this kind of panicked behavior doesn't strike me as something the shrewd and intelligent queen would allow to happen. She had seen 2 of her stepmothers die in childbirth, and probably knew of many more maternal deaths. Could she have been afraid of dying in childbirth while her country was still so unstable and the Protestant religion not yet firmly established? It's a possibility, at least. Considering all the reasons why it wouldn't have been wise for Elizabeth to engage in sexual activity, the question I'm left with is this: what reason could she have for taking a lover? You can point to the, quote, natural appetites of someone like Henry VIII's 5th wife, Catherine Howard, who seemed oblivious to the immorality and danger of cavorting around with men, or even Elizabeth's own ladies-in-waiting, like Lettice Knollys, who became pregnant by one of Elizabeth's favorites, Robert Devereaux. You can say that women, like men, have desires and needs and naturally seek out physical relationships with people they are attracted to or love. But neither Catherine nor Lettice were born royal princesses, and neither of them ever dreamed that they would one day rule England. They were both allowed to have somewhat more lax standards, I believe, and so they did follow their natural appetites. Elizabeth was not nearly as free to do this. She would have had to have had some very seriously compelling natural appetites to overcome all the good reasons there were for not taking a lover. Given how magnificently she ruled England for so many decades, I don't see her as a creature of whims and drives. She strikes me as a very thoughtful, careful, shrewd woman who knew, seemingly from the very beginning of her reign, that she must follow a different path if she were to succeed as a monarch. So what do you think? Do you believe any of these rumors about Elizabeth? Do you believe she was truly the Virgin Queen? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. That's it for this time. Join me next time for another fascinating look at medicine in history, culture, and the arts.